In 1925, the small Jewish community in Palestine had a distinguished visitor. He was Lord Balfour, then an elder statesman and a former British Foreign Secretary. He'd been invited to take part in the opening ceremony of the new Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Most Arabs boycotted Balfour's visit, but wherever he went amongst the Jews, he was acclaimed. Balfour's name was to them an honored one. There was in that Jewish community in the years after the Great War a new sense of confidence. The Jews were no longer there on sufferance, and the Jewish population in Palestine was increasing rapidly. And this increase was approved and encouraged by the new occupying power, the British. Balfour, above all, stood for this approval and basked in the gratitude which the Jews gave to Britain. For 8 years earlier, in November 1917, even before the British victory over the Turks in Palestine was complete and their power in the area fully established, it was Balfour who had given his government's promise, its declaration to the Jews. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration was in the curious form of a letter to Lord Rothschild. To the modern reader, with the advantage of hindsight, it seems full of vague ambiguities, of hostages to fortune. What was meant by that word in Palestine? Part of it? All of it? What was meant by the deliberately vague phrase, a national home? And whatever that meant, could it be realized without detriment to what were called non-Jewish interests? And the phrase non-Jewish, to refer to the Arabs, the vast majority, would seem now, to say the least, a strange form of words. But vague or not, the country which is now Israel still acknowledges the historical importance of the Balfour Declaration. Without the sponsorship of the great power which occupied and controlled the area, the Zionist dream could not have been realized there. There was undoubtedly some sentimental appeal to the Bible-reading British in the idea of establishing a peaceful haven for the Jews in their old homeland. But, and this is what really counted, it was an idea which had the even greater merit of serving their own British interests. How and why did Lloyd George and his wartime government support Zionism and perceive such support to be in Britain's interest? The answer to this question lies in the nature of great power rivalry in the area, rivalry which had existed for many years and was to reach its climax in the Great War. Earlier and striking evidence of that rivalry is plentiful today. This, for example, is a monument to another earlier and even more distinguished visitor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Emperor of Germany. The Augusta Victoria Hospital in Jerusalem, named after his wife, was built to commemorate the state visit of 1898. The Kaiser was received by the Ottoman authorities then with great ceremony. The visit signaled the beginning of that German-Ottoman alliance which was to be so fateful for Palestine in the First World War. But it also served as a reminder to the other great powers of German ambitions in the region. The rash of German churches, German hospitals, and German schools was not simply benevolent. They were a display of German wealth and power in an area whose political order seemed already indeterminate, open to offers. The Germans were not alone in perceiving this, or in making gestures. The Russians had already made their presence felt, on a considerable scale and in great style. The French were characteristically the most explicit about their purposes. The grandiose hospice of Notre Dame was, they said, a great monument to Catholic France, where Russia had crushed us under her millions and her buildings. Notre Dame was to be a colossal witness, they didn't mince their words, to the secular rights we possess here. The claims of France in the area, so clearly and firmly articulated, were in time to cause the British much trouble. Because, of course, the British too had their eye on Palestine. Consecrated in the same year as the Kaiser's visit, the English Cathedral of St. George is a gentler building, more modest in scale, but its mild appearance belies the vigor with which the British pursued their interests. These churches, in their strongly nationalist styles, are reminders now of those great power rivalries which erupted later in less symbolic form. During the bloody and desperate convulsions of the Great War, there preceded a series of diplomatic maneuverings and power struggles amongst the Allies themselves, which matched these military struggles in their intensity. They were concerned with the future disposal of the Ottoman Empire, and in due course, therefore, they involved Palestine, part of that empire. That Ottoman Empire had moved, as we've seen, towards Germany in the years before 1914, and in November of that year joined the war on Germany's side. In the early spring of 1915, the British began to mount the Dardanelles operation to relieve their Russian allies and to break the stalemate on the Western Front. Their object was to capture Constantinople and the Straits. But Constantinople and the Straits constituted a prize coveted for more than a century by their new allies, the Russians. As the Dardanelles campaign opened, the Russians made it clear to the Western allies that when the war was over, these waters and the great city which stood on them were to be Russian. The Tsar sought from his allies what, as former enemies, they had long denied him. So what card did he play? This one. On the Eastern Front, the Russians engaged large and powerful German armies. If these armies were to turn to the west, this would be a disaster for the French and British. There were very strong hints from the Russian leadership that a separate peace would be made if their demands were not met. Stretched on the rack of the Western Front, soon in difficulty in the Dardanelles, the British and French reluctantly gave in to the Russian demands. Round one of the diplomatic game to the Russians. A revolution in the balance of power which triggered off round two. This began as the British and French turned on each other in a diplomatic struggle for what remained of the Ottoman Empire. The French opened the game by asking for a great deal, for the whole of the Levant, beginning on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey itself and running down to what is now the Gaza Strip in southern Palestine. The French wanted all this coastline and a substantial part of the hinterland of that coast, including Palestine. This was not acceptable to the British. The British certainly didn't want the French sitting on the Egyptian border. Egypt was then British, threatening the canal, Britain's gateway to her Indian Empire. After a good deal of give and take, the agreement the French and British finally came to, which was signed in May 1916, produced a map which looked like this. The area which is now called Syria and the Lebanon was to be in the French sphere of influence. The area which is now Jordan, southern Palestine, and a good deal more besides, was to be in the British sphere of influence. Most of the area which was later Palestine was called in the agreement the Brown area. The Brown area was not to be under the control of any particular power. It was to be internationally administered for the ostensibly high-minded reason that the holy places were there. The brown area, roughly Palestine, would be run, among others, by the British, French and the Russians, who were a party to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as it was called, after the names of the principal negotiators. Looked at in terms of British interests, the Sykes-Picot Agreement had succeeded in pushing back strong French claims very substantially. The French were no longer in a position to threaten Egypt. So round two to the British. Some modern commentators, though, have criticized this treaty as a carve-up, a secret and cynical deception. But was it? Professor Eli Kaduri.
This, of course, is a bit anachronistic. What the British and the French, indeed the Russians, or any of the other great powers at that time, what they were proceeding on was the view that they were the great powers of Europe who practically controlled the whole world. And what they were accustomed to consider as the normal situation was for their interests to be reconciled one with the other in some kind of balance of power. Because if these interests were not reconciled, then there was the prospect of conflict. And the conflict would come from Europe, because the situation was that it was the European great powers who were supreme in international affairs. There was no question of a superpower like the Americans. There was no question of a superpower like such as the Soviet had become since. The diplomatic game was a European game, and therefore in any such conflict the wise thing and the beneficent thing to do would be to ensure that in any settlement you were not sowing the seeds of further conflict. That is, you took care to satisfy the interests of the various powers in such a way as to establish a balance of power. This was a classical calculation and a classical situation. And there was nothing really very remarkable or evil in it. On the contrary, I should have said that it was a benevolent calculation.